The Edmonton Oilers pay Calvin Pickard and Stuart Skinner one of the lowest totals in the entire NHL for any goaltending tandem. On today's midseason recap edition of Locked On Oilers, we're going to break down just how much the Oilers are getting out of their goaltending room, if they should go out and add a third goalie to the mix, and why they play better in front of Calvin Pickard than in front of Stuart Skinner.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So on today's show, a wide-ranging conversation about the state of the Edmonton Oilers goalie room. We'll revisit conversation we had last week about the argument for adding a third goaltender to the mix, the overarching organizational philosophy on goaltending, how to evaluate it, how to pay it, and then why they play better in front of Calvin Pickard than in front of Stuart Skinner, and the proof is in the numbers. So starting with the big picture, as we like to do on these recap evaluation episodes. In sports, you are typically paying for cost certainty. When you pay a player a premium rate, you are paying them based on the assumption that A, they are a quality, effective player, and B, they have done it for a sustained, elevated period of time. Because of the way salaries work in the NHL, it's really hard for a young player to get paid unless they're a bona fide star until their mid to late 20s, because you need to be 27 years old, or you need to have 7 years of accrued NHL experience to be considered for NHL unrestricted free agency, which is the first time you as a player have the ability to negotiate with all 32 teams in the league, as opposed to just the team that drafted you and held your rights at the time. So with that in mind, there are differing schools of thought on the goaltender position. We have seen a variety of evaluations and processes bear out well for differing teams in terms of winning a Stanley Cup. This past year, Florida, Sergei Bobrovsky, the first truly elite goalie to reach unrestricted free agency in the salary cap era and paid at the highest rate. The Panthers won the Stanley Cup with him. The year before that, Adin Hill, somebody who was effectively a journeyman who hadn't had an NHL playoff start before that playoff run where they went on to win the Stanley Cup. The year before that, Darcy Kemper was not a reclamation project, but a change of scenery guy from the Arizona Coyotes. He'd always had really solid underlying numbers there, but traded for to augment a Colorado team that had had goalie issues in previous playoff runs where they'd had their starter get injured and lowered the ceiling of their team. Before that, Tampa Bay, high draft pick, somebody they brought on slowly in a tandem with Ben Bishop, before ultimately elevating him, and he kind of rose to the occasion and has ever since been one of the best goalies in the world. Before that, you talk about Jordan Binnington, someone who was a journeyman, who was in the ECHL not that long before in the Bruins organization, somebody who, with a change of scenery, things sparked for him. Before that, Braden Holtby, somebody who had had a really good career, never been elite, but had been right on the precipice of that category, been like 7th or 8th best goalie in the league. Matt Murray, Marc-Andre Fleury, very differing schools. Marc-Andre Fleury, very high draft pick, long time in the organization. Matt Murray, somebody who kind of usurped him along the order. Corey Crawford, Jonathan Quick, Tim Thomas, all goalies who won Stanley Cups in the previous decade. So there is no one way to evaluate your goal, to pay your goalie, There are differing schools of thought as to what is the best way to design a roster. I personally think you need to have at least one, if not two, of those high-end forwards to really organize your team around. That's really the undercurrent when you compare the last 10, 15 Stanley Cup winners. You need at least two elite forwards if you're going to make that happen for you. And goaltending is fickle, it is volatile, and it is very hard to evaluate on a player-by-player basis because it is so environmentally dependent. And that's the first point that'll really bring us to the Oilers part of this conversation. It is really hard to understand how a goalie is going to play on your team until they're doing it. We have seen really good goalies get traded midseason. I think back to the Ryan Miller trade a number of years ago where he got traded from the Sabres to the Blues in season, and it looked like it was going to be the finishing touch on a Blues team that had been hanging around the periphery of Stanley Cup contender, and it didn't ultimately work out. Ryan Miller went on to greener pastures. It is really hard to understand how well a goalie is going to play based on where he's been before, because it's such an environment position. You think about Linus Ullmark in Buffalo and then going to Boston and elevating his game immensely, and going to Ottawa where he's been good, but he hasn't been as good as he was up in Boston. So there's a lot to unpack here, but very clearly the Oilers, after getting burned on the Jack Campbell free agency signing, have said, we think we are better off doing the homegrown, cost-controlled goalie. We will figure out the backup, and we'll talk about Calvin Pickard's unlikely path to being the Oilers' backup in the second segment. But it is an endorsement of the team's forward group and of the defensive group that the Oilers think they can be Stanley Cup contenders paying Pickard and Skinner combined what they are. They pay them at one of the lowest combined cap hits in the entire NHL of any team. And this is a Stanley Cup contender. The team that came into the season with the best betting odds to win the Stanley Cup had one of the lowest cap hits in the entire league. And if we were talking about a team that featured, Jeremy Swayman or Jake Ottinger, one of those young guys who was due for their first big contract and it was just a matter of when, that's a different conversation. The Oilers have consciously made the decision that we're going to go cheap on goalie because we feel the difference between a $3 million goalie room and a $6 million starter isn't big enough that we wouldn't rather have Stuart, Jeff Skinner or Victor Arvidsson. That's $3.5–4 million you're probably going to need to pay to get a starting goalie. You think about that Philip Grubauer deal, which is kind of the baseline for an NHL starter, today's league, 5x5.5, 5x5. And that's $3 million difference between what Stuart Skinner gets and what Philip Grubauer gets. That's Jeff Skinner or Victor Arvidsson. That's a whole forward. And we know materially a forward, even a depth forward, on most occasions is going to be able to exert more of an influence in terms of swinging a game or winning a game outright. I always make the metaphorical explanation of if you had two brick walls playing each other, the game would never end. You can't win just on goaltending. Now, that's not to say I don't value goaltending. There are some teams who are entirely built on goaltending, where the Rangers have spent the entire 21st century oriented around an all-world goalie elevating a team to create off the rush, to take chances, and to be dangerous. And it's worked in the regular season, but as great as Igor Shesterkin and Henrik Lundqvist before him were, they couldn't score the goals too. And that's really kind of the conundrum. So the Oilers' supposition is we would rather put as much money as we possibly can into our skaters and try and elevate our goalie, as opposed to what some of the other teams have done where they try and use a goalie to elevate the rest of their team. They're not alone in this. The Maple Leafs, their combined goalie cap hit's only like $1.5 million. Carolina Hurricanes over the years have done the piecemeal goalie room. There is no one right way to do this. And the proof is in the last 10, 15 Stanley Cup winners, because there have been a variety of different goalie archetypes. It's hard to say one path is definitely or definitively better than the other, even though you probably would want a goalie who's a bit more established, who's a bit more proven than Skinner is, if you fancy yourself a Stanley Cup contender, sure, purely just on experience as opposed to talent. Some guys, Stuart Skinner doesn't have a lot of ice. He hasn't played a lot of games, in all honesty, for what he's at, for his age. And look, goalies are different. They need more time. They typically get developed slower. We're going to take our first break on today's show. We're going to hit on Pickard, Skinner, their respective paths to this point, their career averages so far. We'll talk about the difference in the Oilers' play in front of Pickard versus Skinner, and a whole lot more on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So be sure to stick around. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats that keep you feeling fuller longer. I love the no-shell variety. It's the perfect grab-and-go snack for busy days. I'm going on a road trip this weekend. I have a few packs of these in my bag for the car. Or if you're like me and you also need your quick protein fix, they're a great go-to. And if you're old school and you like cracking open every shell for that satisfying sound, the in-shell options are a classic favorite. Get snackin' and get crackin' with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we're breaking down the Oilers goaltending situation. This is part of our mid-season check-in on the offense, the defense, the goaltending. We still have an episode to do about the coach and GM. Those will be one episode together where we talk about the stakeholders, their decision-making, if their visions have lined up, if the execution of the roster matches based on how we would line things up if from the outside looking in. Then we'll do an episode looking more towards the trade deadline, but those will both come next week. A guest with an episode with a guest, Austin Hockey of YouTube, an Oilers content creator, will drop on Friday. This goaltending episode is on Thursday. We have a Four Nations face-off preview for you yesterday on Wednesday about the big stakeholders, why I'm so excited about it, why you should be excited as a viewer. It's a good time. Even though the Oilers aren't playing, there's plenty of stuff to talk about because we are at such an interesting and frankly crucial point in the season. So neither Calvin Pickard nor Stuart Skinner has an incredible track record, whether we're talking about games played, playoff performance, elite talent. Neither of these guys was a first-round pick, blue-chip goalie. Neither of these guys has a ton of NHL experience. We're 3 years into Stuart Skinner's NHL career as a full-time player. He had a moonlight couple starts several years ago, but his first real extended run was 3 years ago. And at 26 years old, he's made 155 career starts. That's not a lot. 155 career starts averages out to about 40 some odd a season, 50 like 1 a season, 52 a season, something like that. And he's got more starts than his backup, who's 32. Pickard is 32 years old and somebody that the Oilers pulled out of the AHL. He was in Bakersfield a couple years ago and got a call up last year because the Oilers were in dire straits. They needed a backup and they knew they couldn't go back to Jack Campbell. They had to put Campbell on waivers and they had to figure something out. Prior to last year, Calvin Pickard hadn't made more than 10 starts in a season since 2018, 2019, and he hadn't made more than 20 starts in a season since 2016, 2017, when he was on an Avalanche team that won 22 games all year, the year the Avalanche picked Cale Makar third overall. So it's been a while for Pickard to just play this much at the NHL level, let alone have the success he's had in relation to what he's been to this point. And Skinner, former third-round pick, 2 years in the two full AHL seasons of development after junior hockey, called upon in desperate times as a Jack Campbell replacement. And real quick, that Jack Campbell decision, I understood it at the time, but something I really look at when we're talking about projecting a goalie going from a tandem or a backup to being a starter is workload. And that last year in Toronto was the most games Jack Campbell had ever played at any level of hockey. And the Leafs very clearly did not have an alternative. So they kept running him out there. And they burned him out. And the Oilers bore the brunt of that and had to deal with the fact that he was burnt out and he was physically compromised and was injured pretty consistently and struggled and was never able to really bounce back from that. And Stuart Skinner has shown pretty good durability for what the Oilers have asked of him. He's not expected to be the difference between winning and losing, as we always say here on Locked On Oilers. If Stuart Skinner has to be a guy, you probably like the Oilers' chances that night. If he has to be the guy, you're probably going to be sitting with your hands under your butt and holding onto your seat for dear life because he's not that caliber of goalie. There very frankly aren't enough of those goalies in the world for even 10 teams to have one. Even the great goalies aren't playing great this year. You look at Swayman's numbers, Shesterkin's numbers, Saros's numbers, Ottinger's numbers. None of those guys are playing up to their ability. And Connor Hellebuck is a timeless, ageless wonder, and he's continued to show he's the best goalie of his generation. The post-Price, Lundqvist, Luongo trio. He's definitely been the best goalie in the NHL over the last 5 years or so. Vasilevsky, better in the playoffs than in the regular season, which isn't a bad thing. You would always rather your goalie be better in the playoffs than the regular season if you really had to pick one or the other. But something I found interesting, and it took me quite a bit of time to put together the research to do this, but the Oilers play better in front of Calvin Pickard, and the underlying numbers bear this out. So I'm going to click over to my notes here because I want to read them verbatim. So in Calvin Pickard starts, the Oilers concede 1 fewer scoring chance per game. They concede 1.5 fewer shots on goal per game. They concede 0.2 fewer goals per game. They give away 0.2 fewer expected goals per game and 0.7 fewer high danger chances per game. So those seem like pretty inconsequential numbers. 3 of those 4 are under 1 and aren't what you would consider huge statistical differences. And they've played differing volumes of starts. Pickard gets 1 out of every 3 or the second half of a back-to-back. We're sitting here with the goalie room at total 34, 17, and 4, a 900 save percentage, a 2.66 goals against average, and a 0.26 goals saved above expected. Those are not great numbers. Those are not gaudy numbers. And they're a testament to the fact that the Oilers are a skater-driven team. They are not expecting these guys to do a whole lot for them. If you go and look at the box scores on a game-by-game basis, there are a lot of games in here where the Oilers concede 25 or fewer scoring chances, and those are games the Oilers are going to have a good chance of winning, because if you're conceding, 30 some odd scoring chances, 25 or so shots on goal, and you're only asking your goalie to really make 2 or 3 difficult saves a game, and you score at a pretty good clip like the Oilers do, your path to victory is pretty doable. If you're only asking your goalie, hey guy, 25 saves, that's really the upper boundary of what we think is reasonable to win these games. And look, no coach is saying that to their goalie. No GM is thinking that, but that's the way the math shakes out. If the Oilers can control play, they can get zone time, and their defenders don't have to play a ton of defense, and Stuart Skinner or Calvin Pickard doesn't have to make a ton of saves, they're going to have a good chance of winning most nights, because the way the Oilers are built is from the front back. They are built around the idea that our offense is going to have a majority of possession. We are going to have a majority of the offensive zone time, and we only need our defense and our goaltending to be situationally effective. We only need them to make the occasional play, and our big boys up front will take care of most of it. And then you get to the specialization within the defense itself of Ekholm and Bouchard when they're chasing a lead, Nurse and Whomstever when they're playing the other team's best players in a more defensive posture. And then the third pair of just don't go out there and do anything too crazy. It's really that simple. And it puts you in a position where all you need is slightly above average. And that's not unreasonable. I think Stuart Skinner is capable of being slightly above average, and Pickard is fine for what he is. He's going to end up being one of the 5 best backup goalies in terms of wins this year. And look, wins aren't a goalie stat, just like they're not a quarterback stat. But you play well enough to give your team a chance to win, and they put you over the top, that'll play. That'll work. We're going to take one more break on today's show. When we come back, we'll talk the merits of the argument for adding a third goalie to this mix to push Calvin Pickard into more of an emergency backup role, coming up next. Are you looking to optimize your nutrition this year? Factor makes eating well easy with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved meals that are fresh, never frozen, and ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes. With 40 options across 8 dietary preferences every week, you can customize your meals to fit your lifestyle, whether it's Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. Plus, Factor even offers wholesome smoothies breakfast, grab-and-go snacks to keep you fueled all day long. Factor takes the stress out of meal planning. You guys know I take my fitness very seriously. I run, I lift, I count my calories, I count my macronutrients. Factor's Protein Plus meals make it simple to keep track of it all. Convenience is unbeatable. There's no prep, no mess, just great food in minutes. Get smarter with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/LockedOnNHL 50 off and use code LockedOnNHL 50 off to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code LockedOnNHL 50 off at factormeals.com/LockedOnNHL 50 off to get 50% off free shipping on your first box. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on today's edition of Locked On Oilers as we break down the Oilers goaltending situation as part of our midseason evaluation. And we've talked about the Oilers pyramid of success a ton this year, that we start McDavid, Draisaitl dominate their minutes. Then we get to 5-on-5 play. Then we get to defense. Then we get to goaltending. And then we get to supporting cast, the Adam Henriques, Connor Brown, Matthias Janmarks of the world. That's kind of the way the Oilers are built. And I understand the hesitation and the anxiety about Skinner and Pickard as a tandem. I think in an ideal world, you would want to upgrade this position group on a depth basis and frankly on a consistency basis. But again, the Oilers are getting what they pay for. If they wanted a goalie they could bank on a little more consistently, it would cost more money. And they would rather spend that money on an extra forward as opposed to upgrading the tier of goalie they're in. They think that Skinner is good enough. He's somebody they have incubated themselves and brought along with a development plan in mind to put him in a position where he doesn't have to do a ton, but he does have to, on occasion, elevate his game. And it's been spotty at times, 2 playoff runs in a row. He's been yanked at various points. 2 years ago against the Kings, it was for Jack Campbell, who actually had Oilers fans clamoring for him to play, in spite of the fact he had been abominable in the regular season. And this past year, Calvin Pickard had to play 2 games against Vancouver for the Oilers to get right. So it's a real conundrum. And I am not totally married to the idea of upgrading the goalie group ahead of the trade deadline on March 7th. And I think it would behoove the Oilers to go from a position of Pickard being the backup to Pickard being their third goalie. The problem is, if you go out there and you get Vejmelka from Utah or you get a John Gibson from Anaheim, those guys are going to want a more equitable split of the starts. In particular, John Gibson, I know Elliot Friedman mentioned it on 32 Thoughts this week, that he had heard from somebody that the Oilers might be interested in Gibson. We know Carolina has been interested in Gibson because they want to upgrade their tandem and get a little more insurance for Freddie Anderson, who's been a bit of a letdown for them in the playoffs the last couple of years, somebody who's struggled to stay healthy. And when he has played, hasn't always been at his best. When the Hurricanes aren't asking their goalies to do a lot either. They are very much also a built from the front back team where they want their goalie to simply be part of the supporting cast, not have to do a lot. They control the majority of the possession. But in an ideal world, you go get Vejmelka, you go get John Gibson, and you deal with the consequences later. This is kind of the make it or break it year for the Oilers in this iteration, because they're going to have to make some decisions money-wise coming up. Draisaitl's extension kicks in next year. Evan Bouchard and Connor McDavid are eligible to negotiate for extensions this upcoming summer. And that'll be the backdrop against what the Oilers have to figure out their roster's future. I like to think that as long as you maintain Bouchard, Draisaitl, and McDavid as the 3, foundational points of your roster, you're always going to be competitive. But part of being competitive is finding ways to improve on the margins and, frankly, in your main supporting cast. Nuge, Hyman, Ekholm, Nurse even. Nurse is under contract for a lot longer than those other guys, but that age group of guys in their late 20s, early 30s, that group is not going to be here forever. And that presents the opportunity to spend new money. And we know on top of guys aging out, the Oilers are also going to have an increased salary environment to play with. We know the Oilers are going to spend to the cap every year. For whatever you think about Daryl Cates, the person, as owner of the Oilers, he has shown an unwavering commitment to the team spending on making in-season transactions, on putting bonuses into the following year, on paying salary in signing bonus, so guys get lump sums up front as opposed to getting paid out over the course of the season. So in an ideal world, you go out and add a third goalie to this group and Pickard becomes your emergency goalie, because if you have to play Calvin Pickard for an extended period of time in the postseason, he's just not that caliber of player. And there's nothing wrong with being a good NHL backup. And I wouldn't say Pickard is incredible, but he is a competent enough NHL backup that the Oilers can still win games with him in net. And that's not a very high bar, but he does need to do enough for them to win games. And they've won 14 of his 18 starts, and that does matter. For what it's worth, it does matter he has won 14 of his 18 starts. And even if it's with a 901 save and, a 252 goals against, those numbers aren't incredible. They're above league average. League average save percentage right now is like 893, something disgusting like that. We are crossing a Rubicon of goaltending where the averages keep going down, even though the number of shots on goal is also going down. So there's definitely a macro statistical trend happening that needs further examination. But I like what the Oilers have for what they're paying for. I think if you can make the money work more than anything, and the mindset work, I do think that matters, because if you bring in a John Gibson and he expects to start, what does that do to the composition of the room? How do guys handle that? Frankly, how much time do you give Gibson as part of his getting acclimated to Edmonton process? Like, sure, it'll be easier work than in Anaheim, where him and Lucas Dostal are behind a shooting gallery every night because the Ducks play such abominably bad defense between Trouba and Dumoulin and guys who are just entirely over the hill, who don't have the agility or the positional awareness to be effective anymore. But we have seen good goalies go from bad to good situations, and it just hasn't worked out. So I'm very curious to see if that John Gibson noise continues to pick up the closer we get to the trade deadline. But we still got a shade under a month to go. Deadline's March 7th, that Friday. There will be a ton of content between now and then, including an entire episode doing a deep dive into potential acquisitions coming soon. I will talk to you guys tomorrow, where we'll have our guest episode with Austin Hockey. I will talk to you guys then. Until then, let's go Oilers.